Hi, I'm Enfys Book of MajorArtQueerna.com. I want to talk to you a little bit about the dynamic polarities and non-binary aspects of the genderqueer tree of life. First, to introduce myself a little bit, I am the acting high priest of a coven in Kensington, Maryland, affiliated with the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, syncretic tradition. I am also in my spare time in a band called the Misbehaving Maidens, and we are nerdy, dirty, mostly queer band, and we sing about challenging gender stereotypes and binaries. I also really love indoor rock climbing, and part of why I love that is because I love solving puzzles, and rock climbing is kind of like solving puzzles with your body. So these little aspects of me will come into play a little bit later throughout the presentation, and you'll understand why I wanted to mention them here. So in terms of what I'm going to go over, first talk about why is this even worth discussing, why queer the Qabala. I want to go over some definitions of different genderqueer terminology. We're going to do an introduction to Qabala. It's going to be excruciatingly short, but there will be both a story and a brief pathworking for those who are brand new to the concept of Qabala. We're going to talk a little bit about polarity and how that works in magic and ways in which polarity might unintentionally alienate some people in pagan communities. Then we'll go to what does all this mean? And we want to talk a little bit about how to create your own tree a little bit at the end. And then, if this were live, we would also have time for questions and answers. Because this is not live, I would encourage you to reach out to me through my website if you have questions. So why am I talking about this? Well, firstly, I am a Qabala nerd. When I talk about Qabala, I just want to give a caveat that here I'm talking about Hermetic Qabala or ceremonial magic Qabala. This is different and even spelled differently than the Jewish devotional practice of Qabala. When it's an occult thing, it's spelled with a Q. With Jewish tradition, it's traditionally spelled with a K. I'm not qualified to talk about the Jewish tradition, so I'm focusing specifically on the occult thread of Qabala, which has been present for several hundred years. But yeah, so I'm a Qabala nerd, and part of why I'm a Qabala nerd is because I love solving puzzles, as I mentioned earlier. And the Qabala is one big, fascinating, multifaceted puzzle. I read my first book on Qabala in 2013. I've been hooked ever since. But I've also been super frustrated in studying Qabala because the more I read about it, so many of the books approach Qabala from a very patriarchal, heteronormative, racist, ableist viewpoint. The tree of life itself is none of these things, but everyone adds their own experience and worldview when they write about it, myself included. I've written a lot about the Qabala, and my viewpoint is very queer, so it's distinct in that way. But when I look at the tree, I see something that is widely representative, and that belief drove me to make this presentation and also the website MajorArtQueerna.com. So let me tell you a little bit about what I did in 2017. In 2017, I was working on my second degree project for the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, and my concept was that I wanted to deepen our coven's understanding and appreciation of both Qabala and tarot because they are deeply interwoven. If you look at the image on the slide here, you can see that all the cards in a traditional tarot deck map to the Qabala. And there are many reasons for that. They're not going to be part of this presentation, but just going to say they're there. So what I ended up doing for that year as part of the assembly is I also deepened my own understanding of Qabala. And I really wanted our coven to build our inner symbol sets between Qabala and tarot to deepen our magical practice. Now, the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, of which I'm a part, uses Qabala underlying a lot of the different things we do. We have a triangle of stillness casting we use. There's a Hecate ritual that has Qabala underlying it. Our divine embodiment or aspecting protocol is a Kabbalistic casting. One of the founders of our tradition, Ivo Dominguez Jr., likes to say, Qabala is the science that allows you to develop the magical technology. So I was really intrigued by that, which is part of why I'm fascinated with Qabala. So what I ended up doing in 2017 is I developed a series of 8 rituals and 8 one-hour classes to go through all 10 spheres of the Tree of Life. And those rituals involved pathworkings to experience a temple for each sphere. I've open sourced this, as you can see the link on the screen there. Anyone who wants to pick up and take these rituals as they're written is welcome to do so. I've even included a lot of graphical assets and things and correspondence charts in a Google Drive, so please do enjoy. But as I was researching Kabbalah for these rituals, and the deeper I went with my study, I noted, I was like, wow, Kabbalah is really not a binary symbol at all. It's really pretty darn queer, and it's not even sneaky about it. But I was confused because none of the books I was reading were talking about this. Now, I myself have always been deeply intrigued by issues of gender and sexuality. I myself identify as queer. Part of why I like that word for myself is because queer also means strange, and I myself am strange and unusual, to quote Beetlejuice. I've really always been interested with gender and sexuality, and I want to talk a little bit about the term queer and why I use that specifically. So when I'm using the term queer, either as a broad community label or as like an adjective or even a verb to queer something, you know, when I'm using it as a community label, I'm using it as an umbrella term for people who fall outside the straight binary gender role realm. So this includes gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, aromantic, transgender, intersex, gender nonconforming, non-binary, and people who prefer different labels of that, you know, but are still, you know, non-hetero-cis normative, or people who don't like labels, they just know they're not straight and they're not heterosexual. Same thing, straight heterosexual, or that they're not cisgender or both. So one of the great things about the word queer is that you don't have to sort yourself into one of those boxes. And that's part of why I like the term for my own identity, is that, you know, I haven't found a really good term I like to define my own gender and sexuality. That said, I realize that for some people, me using the term queer is jarring and uncomfortable. And it has been and is still used as a slur. And nobody has to use the term queer as a personal identifier. But one of the great things about the LGBTQ community is that we have a long and proud history of co-opting and rebranding the words and symbols that have been hurled against us. And queer is no different. I mean, we have been reclaiming the term queer since the 1980s. And in fact, the academic field of queer theory has been around since 1990. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. One interesting thing about the current backlash against the word queer is that, you know, a lot of terms used for identities in the LGBTQ umbrella have been used as slurs, like gay has been a slur, but you don't see the same pushback against, oh, well, we can't say gay, you know. You don't see people being like, oh, well, gay is a slur, you can't call yourself gay, or you can't use gay to refer to the community. And there's kind of a reason for that. The people who are pushing back against queer as an umbrella term are people who want to see the community divided. They're often people who are not comfortable with transgender people being a part of the community. So queer makes it too open and too all-encompassing for their comfort. So there's kind of this campaign that's been going, trying to, you know, get people to stop using the term because they don't like it being super all-encompassing, which is a shame. One of the reasons that, and I have a whole blog post on why I use the word queer that goes into more depth here, but one thing I've noticed being part of the pagan spiritual community over the last several years is that there's a bit of a blind spot, particularly for non-binary, genderqueer, intersex, and transgender people, especially within certain circles of Wicca. There are rights and things that we just sort of assume this is how it is, that are deeply heteronormative and cisgender focused. So things like the symbolic great rite, which is where you take an athame and a chalice and you insert the athame into the chalice. It's basically symbolic sex, penis and vagina sex. Yes, it is much more than that, but that's sort of like the idea behind it. I hear a lot in these communities about, oh, well, masculine and feminine energy, this binary of like, there's two kinds of energy and they're one or the other. And we'll talk more in depth about that later. We also have a lot of myth cycles that are built around fertility and heterosexual copulation and things like that. And it's not necessarily wrong, but it's just, as traditions that traditionally draw people from the fringes of society, it's really imperative that we continually re-examine our language, our symbols, our assumptions, and our structures to see where they might be alienating rather than embracing people who have too long been underrepresented and misrepresented in mainstream culture, especially when that's due to racism, sexism, and transphobia, homophobia, or xenophobia. We really need to be helping people become more themselves. I really like this quote from Orion Foxwood. Individuals are often drawn to magic when we are tired of being dampened, dimmed, or diminished. When we are emotionally impoverished and spiritually enslaved, our inherent self-worth grows a skeletal structure and volcanic ferocity, especially when freedom, justice, and equity are most challenged and restricted. At all levels, a worker of magic should aim at the larger picture of reducing the presence and power of egregious iniquity. Or, to shorten this, if queer people are coming to pagan traditions looking to become more themselves and claim their personal power, the worst thing we could do would be to dampen that spirit by keeping to rigid binary structures for the sake of tradition or because of lack of creativity on our part. So let's get into definitions here. I'm not going to read this slide to you. I will let you read it. Actually, no, I will, because we want to make sure that folks who are listening to this in audio can also hear it. So I'm going to do the thing and read the slide. When we're talking about genderqueer, genderqueer is an umbrella term with a similar meaning to non-binary. It can be used to describe any gender identities other than man or woman, thus outside the gender binary. Genderqueer identities can include one or more of the following: both man and woman, neither man nor woman, or genderless, agender, neutral, moving between genders, gender fluid, third gender or other gender, those who do not or cannot place a name to their gender, or having an overlap of or blurred lines between gender identity and sexual orientation. There are other related identities too, and this list is not comprehensive. There are, gender fluid we touched on. That describes a gender which varies over time. A gender fluid person may at any time identify as male, female, neutral, or any non-binary identity or some combination of identities. Bigender describes a person who experiences exactly two gender identities, either simultaneously or varying between the two. For more than two, multi-gender could be used. Transgender or trans describes a person whose internal experience of gender does not match the gender they were assigned at birth. Intersex describes a person with sex characteristics like sexual anatomy, reproductive organs, and/or chromosome patterns that do not fit the typical definition of male or female. Non-binary means any gender identity that doesn't fit the binary of man or woman. And Two-Spirit describes Indigenous North Americans who fulfill one of many mixed gender roles found traditionally among many Native Americans and Canadian First Nations Indigenous groups. One note I want to make is, many view transgender as an umbrella term for non-binary, and not all non-binary people consider themselves transgender, but by the definition of a person whose internal experience of gender does not match the gender they were assigned at birth, that pretty well describes non-binary. So, and it is interesting that in 2015, there was a survey conducted of 28,000 transgender people, and 35% of respondents, all of whom were trans, identified as non-binary. So it's a significant chunk of the transgender population. One important note about labeling here, as we're talking about labels: you don't get to label others' identities, and you should respect whatever labels they choose for themselves, because, as I'm sure any cat owner will be able to tell you, someone else putting you in a box is entirely different from getting into a box yourself. And for those who are pagan and identify and are heterosexual and cisgender, and if you're having trouble imagining yourself into a non-binary or non-straight box, note there are some similarities between being queer and being a magical person. Magic and queerness are similar in the way of being elusive to name to specify. What we need to welcome in our lives of queerness and magic is the unsettling restlessness of the potentialities of those identifications. That's a quote from Yin Q. We're going to shift gears here a little bit. Let's talk about Qabala now that we've got some common language to talk about queer subjects. Speaking of boxes and putting things in boxes, Qabala is a valuable and ancient tool that's been put in an unfortunate box. We're not exactly sure when Qabala started. It's at least 1,500 years old and probably older. The glyph we see here dates back to the 1600s. But for those who have familiarity with Qabala, if you've studied it or talked about it or whatnot, it may strike you as patriarchal, hierarchical, binary, sexist. And unfortunately, Kabbalists from the 1900s who wrote some of the major books on the subject were writing from a very sexist, patriarchal, ableist, homophobic, racist point of view, and that comes out in the books. Their understanding of the world and of the tree of life was incomplete and heavily influenced by the biases of their day, as is our own. The problem of this is by no means fixed, but our awareness of and ability to check ourselves on these biases is thankfully improving. So as we discuss it today, we're going to focus on the symbol sets that are attached to this glyph. So if you were to describe the Kabbalistic tree of life to someone who was new to it, you could use terms like, it's a framework for understanding humanity's relationship with divinity. It charts guideposts for personal growth. It's a filing cabinet of the universe. That's one coined by Israel Regardie. And there are a lot of really cool things about Qabala, for all those reasons and more. It's a good way to deepen your understanding of grander forces in the universe. So what's going on in this glyph? Well, we have 10 Sephiroth, or spheres, with 22 paths between them. Now, the spheres also count as paths, so there are 32 total. The spheres represent objective states, sort of. There's a lot of nuance here. I'm using air quotes because part of the point of this presentation, and I would think of Qabala study in general, is to help you embrace the complexities and gray area of the tree. So anything being objective, not so much. People really like to oversimplify when they're teaching, which is a great way to introduce people to a complex subject, but hopefully your education doesn't end there. It's a lot more complex than saying, Qabala is about war and just leaving it at that. It's a good place to start, though. So the paths are subjective experiences of moving between those objective states. Now, each of these spheres has a whole lot of correspondences, things that are sort of grouped, if it's a filing cabinet of the universe, things that are filed in that sphere. These things include deities from various pantheons, astrological correspondences, tarot cards, as we saw before, crystals, animals, herbs, archangels, symbolic images, virtues and vices, illusions, intelligent forces or choirs of angels, scents and perfumes, minerals, like everything. Basically, it is everything. It is life, the universe, and everything, to badly quote Douglas Adams out of context. Ultimately, it's a filing cabinet for the universe, but also the tree represents a flow of energy from concept into manifestation. The top of the tree represents the highest vibration and least tangible powers, broad archetypes and concepts, and the bottommost sphere, number 10 there, represents manifested reality. On the tree, everything is divine. There's no separation between us and divinity. Powers of creation and destruction are both equally divine. That which is manifested is equally divine to that on the highest plane of consciousness. This is different from a lot of mainline religious traditions. A lot of religions are like, we got to get away from this plane. This plane is, unsuitable. We want to go back to perfection. Qabala is like, it's all part and parcel. It's all the same thing. I find things easier to understand with stories, so I wrote a little story to help introduce the Kabbalah to people who are new to it. Once upon a time, before there was time, there was nothing but potential. That potential was contained into one impossibly small, bright dot. And then something happened, and that dot began to expand. And for a while, that was all it did and all it could do, rush out in every direction, limitless and excited to move. But energy without direction can't do anything, so that energy began to take shape. With shape, all things became possible, including beginnings and endings. Time began, and with it, the concept of creation and life. But you can't have everything. Where would you put it all? The universe couldn't just create life and things endlessly. It needed the concept of breaking down. It needed a metabolism to digest itself. It needed to remove and recycle excesses. And with that concept came the potential for balance. The universe realized that all things could not be all at once in every way. Everything needed limits, and to sacrifice potential in order to evolve into its own unique purpose. And seeing its potential for all these unique things, the universe fell deeply, completely, wildly, passionately in love with itself. And in that love, it started to truly see all the possibilities and to give them names so that they could live together and celebrate their differences and similarities, first in the land of imagination, and then finally to be born into existence on this plane in all its splendor, where they could live, die, create, destroy, find balance, love, study, and be. Now, as a filing cabinet of the universe, it's incumbent upon each generation to add to the understanding and depth of knowledge about the tree of life. This is part of the work that I'm participating in. We're at a point in the evolution of the broader human consciousness where our cultural understanding of gender and sexuality is evolving. And that evolution can and should, and I would argue already has been, mapped upon the tree. When I look at the tree, I see a symbol that encompasses all things that ever have been and ever will be, including all genders and all gender expressions. It's also representative of dynamic and fluid gender and polarity. And again, we'll talk more about polarity in a second. I do want to do a little pathworking though, because I find this is another good way to learn the tree, is to experience it through meditation. We're going to work from the bottom to the top of the tree, starting with the most concrete things and going to the most abstract. So I want you to take a deep breath, get really comfortable where you are. If you're sitting, standing, lying down, just take a few deep breaths and close your eyes. Feel your feet firm on the ground, or your seat firm on your seat. Feel the air entering your lungs. Feel the heat of the blood circulating in your body. Feel your heart beating. Bring yourself to a state of being present in this very moment. Now feel the passage of time, each second ticking by. Time limits us. Space limits us. But in time and space, we can create. We can take action. These are the blessings of Malkuth, the 10th sphere. Fill your vision with the color violet. Now think of things that are violet. Picture them in your mind. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you taste? Are these things real? What is real? Here are the visions of everything that has ever been imagined. Visions of what has been and what will be. This treasure house of images and possibilities is the blessing of the 9th sphere, Yesod, and also its curse, for its illusions can trick you. Fill your vision with the color orange. Now make that orange into the bookshelves of the grandest library you've ever seen. Everything known and everything sought to be understood is cataloged here in Hod, the eighth sphere, where it is archived and named. As you walk around this library, you realize you're not alone, and in fact, several divine beings are also in this space. For this is the sphere where the gods go from being pure energy into forms we can understand. Look at the floor, walls, and the ceiling. You'll find them covered in scripts and symbols. This is where words and symbols are created, the containers for magic working that can bring wild energy into focus, and the ways in which we're able to communicate with each other. Now fill your vision with the color green. Now turn that green into the leaves of the dark forest. Smell and hear the abundance of life within a damp forest on a summer's day. Feel the warm, humid air on your skin and become aware of the heat of your own desire. Feel your blood pounding in your veins. Feel your will. It is the projected force of will and energy found here in Netzach, the seventh sphere, which combined with the clarity and focus of Hod creates magic. Now fill your vision with bright gleaming gold. Now apply that colored gold to the sphere within yourself that you identify as your center. Feel it drift within yourself until it finds a place where it feels perfectly balanced. Breathe deeply and feel a deep sense of harmony within yourself and with the energies surrounding you in this room. You are here. You are centered. And here on the center point of the tree in Tiferet, the sixth sphere, is where that gleaming, shining point of equilibrium exists. Fill your vision with a bright red. This red takes the shape of Superman's cape, and then a flag on a battlefield, and then the gown of a judge as they deliver a just verdict. This is the sphere of justice, which allows the balance of Tiferet to exist. When there's something in your life that no longer serves you, where there is excess, Qabala, the fifth sphere, seeks to rebalance the scale. Harsh but lasting lessons are learned here. Feel the fire of Qabala, red hot and blazing, as it strikes you upon the anvil to shape you into the best version of you possible. Now fill your vision with royal blue. The blue becomes the water of a large map, showing a large plot of bare land. You find yourself staring at the map and then instinctively reaching for figures of buildings, walls, and bridges, placing them where they seem to fit best. While Qabala destroys and hones, Hesed, the fourth sphere, builds and envisions possibilities. You feel the work you're doing is blessed, for it and you are all part of the divine spark of creation. And by doing this act, your destiny and will are in perfect sync. Now fill your vision with deep, dark black. Smell the salty air and feel yourself rock gently on the waves as you sit on the dock of a ship. You cannot see and you cannot hear the waves or any other sounds, but you have a profound sense of the vastness and extreme depth of the ocean that surrounds you. But even within the extreme depths of the roiling sea, even within that deep darkness and the silence, there is life. Life is born. Life dies. The great mystery of that cycle is concealed here in the darkness and silence of Bina, the third sphere. Fill your vision with a brightly swirling pearly gray. Feel your body caught in the effervescent tornado of energy, endlessly spinning and filling and bursting without end. You feel as though your every atom is dissipating and your aura expanding to fill an impossibly large space, spreading and rushing and going so very, very fast. In Hakma, the second sphere, you no longer have form. You are part of a stream of pure, endless, rushing energy that fuels the universe, the never-ending expansion of the Big Bang. Now feel yourself calm and focus on a single tiny dot of pure brilliance. In this dot is everything. It is the ultimate place of unity. The entire plan of the universe, everything that was, is, or ever will be, every force, every ounce of energy is contained within and originates from this bright, brilliant dot. Keter, the first sphere. Now slowly imagine that dot fading away. Fill your vision with the swirling pearly gray again. Now deep dark black, royal blue, bright red, shining gold, forest green, orange, violet. And now become aware of the light of this room pressing on your eyelids. Take a deep breath. And when you're ready, open your eyes. Okay. That should give you all a baseline of Kabbalah for those who are new to it, and to make sure we're using the same terminology. Let's move on and talk about polarities a bit. When we talk about polarity in magic, we're talking about a way to describe the interaction of energy. It's the interaction between two different things that produce energy or encourage its flow. I want to talk a little bit about how binary concepts are used in magic and how we can expand on this idea to be more queer inclusive. I'm going to start by getting a little bit controversial and heretical for some folks. So in Wicca in particular, we talk about the interplay between masculine and feminine energy, as if masculine and feminine were opposites, which they're not. Oftentimes, masculine and feminine are used as kind of a shorthand, like masculine energy is active, positive, and projective, and feminine energy is passive, negative, and receptive. It's like tab A inserted into slot B, and boom, magic happens, right? See a problem there? This sounds a little bit like gender roles defined under patriarchy. You know, masculine energy does things and feminine energy has things done to it. That's kind of toxic. Now, these are shorthand for a broader concept that transcends gender, of course. And, you know, unfortunately, it's really easy for people to quickly understand what we mean when we say masculine energy, meaning these things, because we're all steeped in gendered language of our culture and patriarchy that says these things are so, even if we don't completely believe them ourselves. You know, this idea of masculine energy being active and projective and feminine energy being passive and receptive, like that's pretty easy. It's a shorthand. But I really think that we're reinforcing harmful stereotypes by saying that by calling these types of energy masculine to feminine. I'm not saying these types of energies don't exist, but the labels are human created, and therefore humans can change those labels. So in using this kind of energy binary in magic, I find it more helpful to refer to them as projective and receptive energies and leave gender out of it entirely. If you have to use an energy binary, another way you can do that, other than just simply relabeling masculine and feminine energy, is that we have a lot of binary energetic interplays that have nothing to do with gender and are not labeled with gender, like, a left hand holding a right hand in circle. That's, a binary. The act of inhaling versus exhaling, that's an energetic binary. Drum beats, like noise and silence binary, drum beats, chants, the states of being inside or outside of a circle. All of these are types of binary energy that a lot of us who practice magic use all the time, but we don't think about them as energetic binaries. Our predecessors in the Age of Pisces really loved dualities and like putting things into a very, this box or this box in expressing everything. And it's useful to some degree. It's a very simple way to explain things to people, but we're really not beholden to that. We also aren't beholden to the idea of energy as a binary. The word polarity is kind of problematic because it implies only two states. So probably a better way to express it is by using the word valence. Non-binary or relative polarity is also used a lot in magic already. For those who use the pentacle, this is, many different ways in which things are interacting energetically. If you are, circulating energy, that's a non-binary polarity or a valence. Bringing a group to focus on something together, there's resonance with that. Chanting and singing and dancing, these are all examples, like elements, zodiac signs, like all these non-binary energies are out there and we can use them. I just think it's sort of funny that we seem to talk about the way you make magic is with masculine and feminine energy. It's not true. This quote is from a really fantastic essay called Redefining and Repurposing Polarity in the anthology Queer Magic, Power Beyond Boundaries, where Ivo Dominguez Jr. says, polarity can also be an entangled state of mutual interaction of relationship between forces and or forms that share essential natures, thematic resonance, or primal attraction. So I think looking at polarity instead as like a valence is a really great way to queer your magical practice. This is the Genderqueer pride flag, and what we just did in talking about, polarity and valences, we were breaking down a traditional binary polarity and looking at it with a new lens, which is one of the hallmarks of queer theory. This is a term, an academic study that started in 1990. Queer theory seeks to break down societal norms, roles, and traditional binaries to see how they came to exist, question why they still hold sway, and whether they have any merit at all. It encompasses gender, sex, and sexuality. Another way of putting that is queer theory is about breaking down binaries which oversimplify the world into everything being this or that. Now, queer lenses are helpful in so many areas of life, whether or not you're queer. A queer lens compels you to question anything you assume is normal, and I think that's very healthy. Why do we do certain things in certain ways? It may just be habit. It may be cultural programming. We may not be doing things the way that is actually the best way to do them. We're just doing them out of habit. And queering your magical practice is something, it's not just limited to something queer people can and should do. It can really benefit all of us because it enriches your practice. It helps you dive deeper into the why, behind why you're doing certain things, focusing on what works as opposed to what we assume is true. And the way magic works for you may be very different from how it works for someone else, and that's okay. A bonus of this is that it makes our magic, when we do it in community, it makes our communal magic more inclusive and representative of a greater variety of people and experiences. So think about different ways you can queer your practice. Like we talked about the symbolic great right earlier. One way you can do that is use two different tools. Like, doesn't have to be a chalice and an apame. You could use two of the same tool, two wands, sure. You could use multiple tools to perform a symbolic great right, to combine those sort of energies together. Consider, for those who call to the god and the goddess, consider calling to, more than that, like call to the divine masculine, the divine feminine, and the divine both and neither. That's awesome. Also, one thing we already do a lot is we work with liminal spaces. And I think deepening your relationship with things that are both and, or things that are neither nor, like liminal spaces, like crossroads. A lot of us use that in our practice. Being at the edge of like land and water, that kind of thing. Um, there's so much power in the liminal. And especially when it comes to like genderqueer issues, there is a tremendous amount of power in having, feeling like you are not just in one box or another, but that you transcend them all. I really think it's wonderful. And one kind of great thing, silver lining, I guess, of pandemic life is that a lot of us have been questioning a lot of assumptions about how ritual and conferences have to be done. And one of the happy outgrowths of that has been making our rituals and classes more accessible to people who have disabilities or who don't live nearby or have a circumstance that makes it difficult to leave their home. And I personally really hope we don't lose this critical outreach as things begin to open up. And we continue to find ways to make our rituals and classes more accessible to a wider audience. So, all that said, we're going to circle back to Qabala now. We've talked about some definitions of genderqueer. We've talked about polarity. We've got a brief overview of the Qabala itself. We've talked about what queer theory is, so it's time to queer the Qabala. Now, I want to start by saying Qabala is queer. I'm not saying Qabala could be seen as queer. It simply is queer. Nothing I'm about to discuss about the tree was like, all of this has been determined well before I was born. This is not me putting rainbow glitter on the tree. This is me just piecing together what people have said about the tree and going, that's interesting. So let's start by talking about the structure of the tree. So we've got 3 pillars here. Now the ones on the left and the right are known as the masculine and feminine pillar. They're also known as the pillars of force and form, mercy and severity. But what does that mean? Like, what kind of energy are we talking about here? Because obviously this is a metaphor. We're talking about what limits versus what creates. But I think it's very interesting that, the early people working in Qabala talked about masculine and feminine pillar. And yet, what is on each of these pillars does not match at all necessarily with masculine and feminine. So on the masculine pillar, we have the sphere of Netzach, which is represented by Venus. That's pretty feminine. We also have Gabura, which is represented by Mars on the feminine pillar. And then we have Hod, which is represented by Mercury, also on the feminine pillar. This is our first clue that the tree is playing loose with gender and our traditional assumptions of it, which is awesome. In the middle, though, we have the pillar of balance. We have a non-binary pillar of the tree. And I want to remind you, this glyph was created in the 1600s. And we have non-binary representation here, just out of the box. They could have made a tree with just 2 pillars. They didn't. They made one with 3. And, we were talking about polarity before. Look at all the different sort of multivalent polarities you could consider on the tree. Just looking at all these different paths. There are so many different ways for energy to interact here. And another thing I think is interesting is on that non-binary pillar in the middle, we have arguably the most important spheres in the tree. We have Keter, which is ultimate supreme unity. We have Malkuth, which is manifestation. And in between, we have the sphere of balance, Tiferet, and the sphere of imagination, Yesod. And by putting those on the non-binary pillar, we're saying that those things definitely transcend gender and binary polarity, which I think is really cool. Another way in which the tree plays with gender is with what are called magickal or telesmic images. These are images we can use to meditate upon, to deepen our understanding and relationship to each sphere by basically anthropomorphizing it. Now, all these images are free Wikimedia things. These are not like the literal images, but these were developed by people in the early 20th century. So what's interesting is that, okay, kind of going down the line here. So Keter, the magical image, is a bearded ruler in profile. Hakma is a bearded man face to face. Bina is a mature woman. Hesed is a king on a throne, or ruler on a throne. Tiferet is like a sun child. Gabora is a warrior in a chariot. Netzach is a beautiful naked woman. Hod is an intersex person. That's the magical image for Hod. This is over 100 years old. I'm not making this up. We have had intersex representation on the tree for well over 100 years. Yesod is a beautiful naked man, very strong, and Malkuth is a young queen crowned and throned. And I think, very cool that we have intersex representation on the tree. But what's also interesting is that Yesod, which is the sphere of imagination, it's the treasure house of images, it's deeply connected with the moon, which, in many traditions is very closely aligned with the feminine or female power. But its representative image is a strong naked man. I think that's really interesting. And also that these images do not align with the masculine and feminine pillar largely. We have intersex representation on the feminine pillar, we have a naked woman on the masculine pillar, and the non-binary pillar, of course, we've got a little bit of everything. The next thing where Kabbalah gets interesting when it comes to gender is the Hebrew names of the spheres. Now, Hebrew names have masculine or feminine endings. They don't correspond to the pillars either, nor do they alternate, nor do they correspond with the magical image associated with them by and large. If you look at this diagram here, Keter is masculine, both Bina and Chokmah are feminine. And I think that's amazing because when you read about Kabbalah, there's like, oh, Bina is the supreme divine feminine and Chokmah is the supreme divine masculine. It's the cosmic phallus. It's, all this very, very male, symbolism. But they're both feminine names. So I like to refer to them as the lesbian power couple at the top of the tree, which probably makes a lot of traditional Kabbalists very upset, but I'm okay with that. Another thing I want to note is that Gabora and Hesed are known by two different names. It kind of depends on which book you read. And each one has both a masculine and a feminine name. So we have two effectively gender fluid spheres here. We do have roughly half and half, though, masculine and feminine names, which is kind of cool. So now I want to talk a little bit about the lightning flash. Now, the energy from the tree emanates from Keter and travels down the tree, being changed and adapted along the way until it's manifested in Malkuth, with this sort of lightning flash pattern that you see here. Kind of picture a champagne glass tower where you pour champagne into the top glass, then it overflows into the glasses on the next level, and then the glasses on the next level. That's kind of how the energy moves down. Now, every sphere here, except for two, asterisk, we're coming back to that, has both polarities represented when they're placed in relation to the spheres before or after them on the lightning flash. So Chokmah is receptive to Keter and projective to Bina, or in other words, it's behaving in a feminine way in relation to Keter and a masculine way in relationship to Bina. I think that's very interesting. So not only are each sphere, behaving in both masculine and feminine ways, they're also bisexual, basically. They're both acting in masculine and feminine, like they're energetically interacting in both projective and receptive ways with spheres that are both projective and receptive in relation to them. Now, talking a little bit about, is Keter purely projective and is Malkuth purely receptive? No, for a number of reasons. One of the phrases we use a lot in Kabbalism is that Malkuth is in Keter and Keter is in Malkuth. This diagram's imperfect. It's really kind of a spiral situation. And there's a few different ways in which Keter is in Malkuth and Malkuth is in Keter. First of all, like if you do the four worlds, the Keter of this tree of Asaya would be, would be the Malkuth of the tree of Yetzirah, for example. So it literally acts as both. But also, one thing I want to note is that within each sphere, there is another tree. Like the tree is basically a giant fractal. If you look at it on a micro level, it looks the same as it does on the macro level. So there's trees within trees within trees. And what is kind of cool here is that, in my tradition, we talk about the nuances of the elements, like the air of water or the earth of fire. And in the same way, there is a Malkuth of Yesod, and there is a Keter of Malkuth, and a Malkuth of Keter, and a Gabura of Keter, and so on. So all this to say, my point being, all the spheres are both masculine and projective, and feminine and receptive, and non-binary or gender fluid at the same time. Every sphere contains every other sphere like a giant fractal, and therefore the entire tree is queer. So what does this mean? Humans tend to oversimplify gender and put things into specific boxes, and so do pagans. We're no exception. But the tree is a balanced yet fluid and representative of all these energies and gender identities. They're all there. And none of what I just told you is stuff that I added on. Masculine, feminine, both, neither, non-binary representations, intersex representations on the tree are based on symbol sets that are at least 100 years old, if not many hundreds of years old. And I think that's kind of amazing. You know, considering its age, the Tree of Life is a very genderqueer and non-binary, inclusive and affirming magical tool. Thinking in binaries can be helpful because it's simple, but I hope that people want to go beyond them in our magical practice in particular, because complexities can deepen our understanding of things. You know, and everything is a little bit, you know, within each other, right? Like male, female, non-binary, we all have more in common than we are different. We're all human beings. We're all the energy on the tree comes from the same place. It all comes from Keter. Keter contains basically the blueprint for everything that will or could possibly be. And the fact that we're all kind of united in that, there's beauty in that unity, right? But there's also the risk of saying, you know, we're all one and our differences don't matter, because that usually leaves people feeling like they're erased and like their unique experience is not important. And so yes, on the cosmic scale, we are all one, but guess what? We're here on Malkuth, where everything's manifested and everyone has a slightly different experience, and we need to honor that. When we oversimplify these concepts to teach, people end up feeling left out. You know, when we really double down on masculine and feminine energy, for example, and, you know, like tab A slot B, well, you know, that's not something that is necessarily that everyone wants to connect to, that type of energy. There's power in representation, and I think it's important that everyone be able to see themselves in their magic. You know, the fact that things like an intersex person and, you know, gender non-binaries and fluidities are represented on the tree but rarely discussed. Like, I have yet to read a book that touches on this, except for the Hebrew names came from Rachel Pollack's book on the Qabala. But she sort of says, oh, here are what the names are, and then kind of runs at top speed from the concept. So I think it's really interesting that this, to me, is very obvious, but we're not really talking about it. And granted, I have a small sample size. I have not read every single Qabala book ever. I have not attended every Qabala workshop ever. But still, I think it's significant that in the year, you know, 2021, as I'm recording this isn't a strong conversation that's already happening. And I just think it's really interesting. And I think it really, like I said at the beginning, it behooves us to make our magic inclusive. You know, especially within the pagan community, we tend to be very homogenous and make up our conferences are very, very white, very abled. And most people who attend tend to be somewhat financially comfortable. And this is changing, but slowly. And part of what's going to help us expand and you know, become a larger, more diverse movement is that we need to rethink our symbol sets and our assumptions about how magic works. And we need to think about it through intersectional lenses, queer lenses, decolonized lenses, through a disabled lens. We need to think through all of these things. In my tradition, we like to say, as above, so below. And this is on the tree in that, you know, all the potential is in Keter and all the manifestation is in Malkuth. Our magical practice is built on the concepts of both stunning, profound unity in all things in Keter, and the fascination with the diversity of all the different kinds of life on this plane in Malkuth. One does not negate the other, and I think we should celebrate both. The Kabbalah teaches us that we should seek to understand and continually open ourselves to understanding on a deeper level everything in the universe. When it comes to Kabbalah, I encourage you to embrace the complexities of it without letting them intimidate you. One of my favorite sayings is, there is always another book to read. You could spend several lifetimes studying Kabbalah, and there'll always be more to learn and unlock. And I think that's exciting and amazing. Recognize that the early teachings on Kabbalah and present teachings are incomplete. We have the opportunity to expand. And like I said before, it's incumbent upon all new generations of Kabbalists to add to our depth of understanding of the tree. Now, the tree you see on the screen here is one that I designed as part of my study work. But I actually didn't stop there. I have designed a bunch of different trees, and this is another one that I used on my blog, Major Arqueerna, that last year I had a blog series where I walked through each sephirah and what makes them queer. Now, the link will be, in the description and at the end of the presentation where you can check it out. But I encourage you to consider other things you enjoy that could be mapped to the Kabbalah. Your favorite movies, video games, books. I made a Steven Universe Kabbalah. It's pretty awesome. It helps deepen your understanding and appreciation of the tree when you can relate it to things that make more sense to you, honestly, like things with good archetypes that you can relate and be like, oh, well, this is like here. And you as a practitioner in this time can add to the beauty and understanding of this important magical tool. I have a whole lot of further reading. I'm going to include this in the description too, in case you missed this particular screen. Also, there's a lot more on Queer Qabala from my website, majorarqueerna.com. Coming soon, as I post this, possibly out already by the time you watch this video, is a book on Queer Qabala that's going to be published by Llewellyn in the summer of 2022. I do have a few notable blog posts that I recommend you check out. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop me a line. You can find me at majorarqueerna.com. I'm available on Twitter and other social channels as @majorarqueerna, and you can email me at info@majorarqueerna.com. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.